The rain had been falling softly over Millbrook for 3 days now, the kind of gentle autumn rain that turned the brick streets into mirrors and made the whole town smell like wet earth and old wood. The drops tapped against windowpanes in a rhythm that felt almost like a lullaby, steady and unhurried, as if the sky itself was trying to ease the world into a state of calm. The leaves, gold and crimson and deep amber, collected in soft piles along the sidewalks, and when people walked through them, they made a sound like whispered secrets, quiet and rustling and peaceful. In the heart of the town, tucked between a bookshop with a faded green awning and a bakery that always smelled of cinnamon and brown sugar, there was a restaurant called Marcella's. It wasn't a grand place, nothing polished or pristine, but it had a warmth to it that drew people in on cold evenings. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and there were brass lamps hanging from the ceiling that cast everything in a gentle, golden glow. The tables were old oak, worn smooth by years of use, and the chairs had cushions covered in faded burgundy fabric that still felt welcoming somehow, still felt like home. Marcella's had been there for 40 years, a fixture of the town, a place where families came to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries, where couples shared quiet dinners over flickering candles, where the elderly came alone on Tuesday afternoons just to sit in the warmth and feel less lonely. The kitchen was always busy, always humming with life, the sound of pots clanging and knives chopping and oil sizzling in pans, and underneath it all there was the low murmur of conversation, laughter, the occasional burst of song from the line cooks who had been there so long they felt like family. And in the very back of that kitchen, past the stoves and the prep stations and the walk-in refrigerator that hummed like a sleeping bear, there was a small alcove with a deep metal sink, always filled with soapy water, always piled high with plates and glasses and silverware that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. This was where Daniel worked. Daniel was 43 years old, though he looked older, his face lined with the kind of fatigue that comes from years of hard work and not quite enough sleep. His hair was gray at the temples, cut short and practical, and his hands were rough and red from the hot water and the harsh soap he used every day. He wore the same thing to work every shift: dark jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a black apron that was stained and frayed at the edges, no matter how many times he washed it. He moved through his task with a quiet efficiency, scrubbing plates until they shone, rinsing glasses until the water ran clear, stacking everything carefully on the drying racks with a precision that spoke of someone who took pride in his work, even when no one was watching. He had been washing dishes at Marcella's for 6 months now, ever since he'd arrived in Millbrook with nothing but a duffel bag and a few $100s in his pocket. Before that, he'd been in the city, living a different life, but he didn't talk about that much. When people asked, he would just smile in that gentle way of his and say something vague about needing a change, needing some peace and quiet, and they would nod and let it go, because Daniel had a way about him that made people feel like they shouldn't pry. There was something in his eyes, something sad and distant, but also kind, infinitely kind. And when he spoke, his voice was low and soft, the kind of voice that made you want to lean in a little closer, to listen a little more carefully. He lived alone in a small apartment above the bookshop next door, a cramped space with creaky floorboards and a window that looked out over the alley where the restaurant's dumpsters were kept. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he'd made it comfortable in small ways. There was a worn armchair by the window where he would sit in the evenings with a book and a cup of tea, and he'd hung a few prints on the walls, landscapes mostly, peaceful scenes of mountains and forests and quiet lakes that seemed to calm him. He didn't own much. Just some clothes, a few books, a radio that he kept on the kitchen counter and tuned to the classical music station. His life had become simple, almost monastic, and there was something healing about that simplicity, something that felt like a balm on old wounds. Every morning, Daniel would wake early, before the sun had fully risen, and he would make himself a pot of coffee in the little percolator on his stove. He would drink it slowly, standing at the window and watching the light change over the rooftops, watching the town wake up in soft increments. The bakery next door would start its ovens, and the smell of fresh bread would drift up through the floorboards, warm and yeasty and comforting. The bookshop owner, a woman named Margaret with white hair and kind eyes, would unlock her door and sweep the sidewalk, humming to herself, and sometimes she would look up and wave at Daniel through his window, and he would wave back. And that small exchange would feel like enough, like connection, like being seen. Then he would dress and walk downstairs and through the alley to the back entrance of Marcella's, slipping in through the heavy metal door that always stuck a little, and he would tie on his apron and roll up his sleeves and begin his day. The work was hard, physically demanding, the kind of work that left his shoulders aching and his hands pruned and sore. But there was something meditative about it too, something soothing in the repetition. Scrub, rinse, stack. Scrub, rinse, stack. Over and over, hour after hour, and his mind would drift, would wander to other times, other places, and he would let it, would let the memories come and go like clouds passing overhead. The kitchen staff at Marcella's were kind to him, in their way. They didn't talk to him much. He was the dishwasher, after all, at the bottom of the restaurant hierarchy, and they were busy with their own tasks, their own dramas and deadlines, but they weren't cruel. Sometimes they would nod at him when they brought back a stack of dirty plates, or they would leave him half a sandwich on the counter during their break, a small gesture of solidarity. The sous chef, a young woman named Carla with tattoos up and down her arms and a quick, bright laugh, would occasionally ask him how he was doing, and he would smile and say he was fine, just fine, and she would nod and go back to chopping onions or stirring sauces, and that would be that. The owner of the restaurant, Marcella herself, was a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and a face that had once been beautiful and still held traces of that beauty, in the shape of her cheekbones and the clearness of her eyes. She moved through the dining room like a ship through calm water, graceful and unhurried, greeting regulars by name, making sure everyone was comfortable, occasionally stopping at a table to chat about the weather or someone's grandchildren. She rarely came into the kitchen, and when she did, she barely glanced at Daniel, just a quick nod in his direction before she moved on to talk to the chef or check on the prep work. To her, he was invisible, or close to it, just another piece of the machinery that kept her restaurant running. But there was someone at Marcella's who did see Daniel, though not in the way he would have hoped. Her name was Vanessa. Vanessa was Marcella's granddaughter, 26 years old and beautiful in a sharp, polished way that felt almost intimidating. She had long, dark hair that fell in perfect waves down her back, and she wore expensive clothes, silk blouses and tailored pants, and designer shoes that clicked against the floor when she walked. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having wanted for anything, never having had to struggle or compromise or make do. She'd grown up in privilege, in a big house on the edge of town, and she'd been spoiled, doted on, given everything she asked for and more. Her grandmother adored her, indulged her, and Vanessa had learned early on that she could get away with almost anything as long as she smiled the right way or turned on the charm. She worked at the restaurant, though worked might have been too strong a word. She was supposed to be the assistant manager, learning the business so that one day she could take over from her grandmother. But mostly she drifted through the dining room during dinner service, chatting with customers, taking selfies in front of the antique mirror by the hostess stand, occasionally barking orders at the waitstaff when she felt like exerting some authority. She didn't understand the restaurant, didn't understand the work that went into it, the long hours and the exhaustion and the 1,000 small decisions that had to be made every day to keep things running smoothly. To her, it was just a backdrop for her life, just a place where people told her how pretty she was and served her whatever she wanted. And she was not kind. Daniel had noticed this early on, in small ways at first. The way she would snap at the servers if they were too slow, the way she would roll her eyes when a customer asked a question she thought was stupid, the way she would laugh, a sharp, brittle sound, when someone made a mistake. She had a cruelty to her that seemed almost casual, almost unconscious, as if she didn't even realize the effect her words had on people. Or maybe she did realize, and she just didn't care. She never spoke to Daniel directly, not in those first few months. To her, he was even more invisible than he was to her grandmother, just a shadow in the back of the kitchen, someone who cleaned up after other people and didn't matter. But he would see her sometimes, through the window that separated the kitchen from the dining room, see her laughing with her friends at one of the corner tables, see her checking her phone while customers waited to be seated, see her tossing her hair and smiling that bright, empty smile. And then, one evening, everything changed. It was a Saturday night, the restaurant's busiest shift of the week. The dining room was packed, every table full, and the kitchen was chaos. Orders coming in faster than the cooks could keep up, the ticket machine spitting out receipt after receipt, the chef shouting instructions over the hiss of the grill and the clatter of pans. Daniel was drowning in dishes, his sink overflowing, and he was moving as fast as he could, his hands a blur as he scrubbed and rinsed and stacked, but it felt like he was fighting a losing battle. Sweat dripped down his face, and his back ached, and his fingers were raw, but he kept going, kept pushing through, because that was what he did. That was all he could do. Vanessa came into the kitchen through the swinging door, moving with that confident stride, and she was holding a tray of half-empty wine glasses, lipstick stains on the rims, remnants of expensive Merlot pooling at the bottom. She walked past the chef, past the line cooks, and she stopped at Danielle's station, and she just stood there for a moment, staring at the piles of dishes with a look of faint disgust on her face. "God, what a mess," she said, loud enough for the whole kitchen to hear, though her voice had that light mocking tone to it, as if she were commenting on something amusing rather than something that actually mattered. Daniel glanced up at her, his hands still in the soapy water, and he gave her a small, polite nod. "I'm working on it," he said quietly, and then he turned back to his work, reaching for another plate. But Vanessa didn't leave. "I don't know how you stand it back here," she continued, wrinkling her nose. "It smells like grease and bleach. Don't you ever feel like you're just wasting your time?" There was a pause, a beat of silence in the noisy kitchen, and Daniel could feel eyes on him now, the line cooks glancing over, curious, waiting to see how he would respond. He kept his face neutral, kept his voice calm. "It's honest work," he said. "Someone has to do it." Vanessa laughed then, that sharp, brittle sound, and she set the tray down on the counter next to his sink with a loud clink. "I guess so," she said. "But I mean, washing dishes? At your age? Don't you ever feel like you should be doing something more with your life?" Her words hung in the air, cutting and casual all at once, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, something old and familiar, a kind of pain he'd learned to live with but never quite got used to. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and he saw the way she was standing there, arms crossed, a little smirk on her face, and he understood that this wasn't about him, not really. This was about her need to feel superior, to put someone else down so she could feel a little taller. He took a breath, slow and steady, and he turned back to the sink. "I'm content," he said quietly. "That's enough for me." Vanessa made a sound, something between a scoff and a laugh. "Content?" she repeated, as if the word was foreign to her, as if she couldn't imagine settling for something as small as contentment. She picked up one of the wine glasses from the tray, held it up to the light, and then set it down again. "Well, I guess that's one way to live," she said. "Low expectations and all that." And then she walked away, back through the swinging door into the dining room, and the kitchen slowly returned to its rhythm, the cooks turning back to their stations, the orders piling up, the noise rising again. But Daniel stood there for a moment longer, his hands still in the water, and he felt something settle over him, a kind of weariness that went deeper than the physical exhaustion, deeper than the ache in his muscles. It was a weariness of the soul, a reminder of all the ways the world could be unkind, all the ways people could look at you and decide you were less than, decide you didn't matter. But he didn't let it stop him. He scrubbed the next plate and the next and the next, and he let the work carry him through, let the repetition soothe him, and eventually the hurt faded into the background, became just another thing he carried with him, another weight he'd learned to bear. The rain kept falling outside, soft and steady, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the hour, low and resonant and calming, and Daniel let the sound wash over him, let it remind him that time kept moving, that this moment, like all moments, would pass. And he kept washing the dishes, one by one, in the warm, soapy water, and he told himself that tomorrow would be better, that tomorrow always had the possibility of being better, and that was enough. That had to be enough. Act 2. The slow unfolding of difficulty. The days that followed moved with the same gentle rhythm they always had, the same quiet progression of mornings turning into afternoons, turning into evenings, and Daniel fell back into his routine with the kind of practiced ease that comes from doing something over and over until it becomes second nature. He woke before dawn, made his coffee, watched the light change over the rooftops, and then he walked downstairs and through the alley to Marcella's, and he tied on his apron and began his work. But something had shifted, something small and almost imperceptible, like a stone thrown into a still pond, the ripples spreading out in widening circles. Vanessa had noticed him now. It wasn't that she paid him any more attention than before, In fact, she still barely looked at him. But there was a change in the way she moved through the kitchen, a kind of awareness that hadn't been there before. She would glance in his direction when she came through with dirty dishes, and there would be something in her expression, something smug and knowing, as if she'd marked him as someone beneath her, someone she could dismiss without a second thought. And she started making comments. Small things at first, little jabs delivered with that same light, mocking tone, as if she were just teasing, just having fun. She would drop a tray of dishes on his counter a little too hard, making them clatter and splash water onto the floor, and she would say something like, "Oops, sorry, didn't see you there," even though they both knew she had. Or she would walk past him and wrinkle her nose and say, "Do you ever go home and feel like you can't get the smell of this place off you?" And she would laugh, that sharp laugh, and then she would be gone, back into the dining room, leaving him standing there with soapy hands and a tightness in his chest. The other staff noticed. Daniel could see it in their eyes, the way they would glance at him with something like sympathy or maybe pity when Vanessa said something cutting. And Carla, the sous chef, started leaving him more food during her breaks, little acts of kindness that felt like apologies for something that wasn't her fault. The line cooks were a little gentler when they brought back dishes, a little more careful not to add to his workload. Even the servers, who usually ignored him completely, would give him small smiles when they passed, as if they were trying to make up for Vanessa's cruelty with their own small gestures of warmth. But no one said anything to her. No one told her to stop. Marcella, when she was in the restaurant, never seemed to notice. She was too busy with the customers, too focused on keeping the dining room running smoothly, and Vanessa was her granddaughter, her pride and joy, the girl she'd raised after Vanessa's mother had died in a car accident when Vanessa was just 8 years old. Marcella had poured all her love, all her grief, into that child, had given her everything, had shielded her from the harshness of the world, and in doing so, had perhaps shielded her from the lessons that might have made her kinder. So Vanessa continued, and Daniel endured. He didn't fight back. He didn't argue or defend himself or try to explain that he was more than what she saw, more than just a dishwasher, more than someone who deserved her scorn. He just kept working, kept his head down, and when she said something cruel, he would take a breath and let it pass through him. Let it go, because what else could he do? He needed this job. He needed the small apartment above the bookshop, the routine, the stability. He needed the quiet life he'd built here in Millbrook, fragile as it was. And besides, he'd been through worse. There were nights when he would lie awake in his narrow bed, listening to the rain tap against the window, and he would think about the life he'd left behind. The restaurants he'd worked in, the kitchens he'd run, the reviews he'd written. He'd been someone once, someone respected, someone whose opinion mattered. He'd traveled to cities all over the country, had eaten in the finest establishments, had sat across from chefs and owners and discussed their techniques, their philosophies, their dreams. He'd written thousands of words, carefully crafted sentences that could make or break a restaurant, and he'd taken that responsibility seriously, had tried to be fair, to be honest, to see the humanity in the work. But then things had fallen apart. It had started with burnout, the kind that crept up slowly, so slowly he hadn't noticed until it was too late. The constant travel, the pressure, the endless deadlines, the need to always have an opinion, to always be sharp, to always be on. He'd started drinking too much, using it to quiet the noise in his head, to ease the anxiety that had become a constant companion. And then there was the divorce, painful and drawn out, and the realization that he'd let his work consume him, that he'd neglected the people who mattered most, that he'd become someone he didn't recognize. So he'd walked away. He'd quit his job, sold most of his possessions, and left the city with no plan and no destination, just a need to disappear, to start over, to find some kind of peace. He'd ended up in Millbrook almost by accident, had seen the help wanted sign in Marcella's window and walked in and asked for the job, and Marcella had looked at him with those clear, assessing eyes and said, "You look like you need this." And he'd nodded, and she'd hired him on the spot. And for 6 months, it had been enough. The work was hard, but it was simple, and there was something healing in that simplicity. He'd started to feel like himself again, or at least like a version of himself he could live with. He'd stopped drinking, he'd started reading again, really reading, losing himself in books the way he used to when he was younger. He'd found a kind of rhythm, a kind of peace. But Vanessa's cruelty was starting to wear on him, starting to chip away at the fragile stability he'd built. It wasn't the words themselves. He'd heard worse, been through worse. But it was the casual nature of it. The way she seemed to think he was less than human, less than deserving of basic respect. And it reminded him of all the times he'd been dismissed, overlooked, underestimated. And it hurt in a way that surprised him. Hurt in a way that felt both fresh and ancient. Still, he kept going. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Vanessa had first spoken to him, Daniel was in the middle of his shift, working through a particularly large pile of dishes from the lunch rush, when Marcella came into the kitchen. She moved slowly, her steps careful, and she was carrying a clipboard, which meant she was doing inventory or checking on orders, something administrative and important. She stopped near the prep station and started talking to the chef, a burly man named Rick, who'd been with her for 20 years, and Daniel could hear their voices, low and serious, discussing suppliers and menu changes and the rising cost of ingredients. He was only half listening, focused on his work, when he heard Vanessa's voice cut through the kitchen noise. "Grandma, can I talk to you for a second?" Marcella looked up, and her face softened immediately, the way it always did when she saw her granddaughter. "Of course, darling. What is it?" Vanessa glanced around the kitchen, and her eyes landed on Daniel for just a moment before moving away. "I was thinking," she said, her voice bright and casual, "we should really think about upgrading some of the equipment back here. I mean, the dishwasher area especially. It's so outdated." Marcella frowned slightly, following Vanessa's gaze. "The equipment works fine," she said. "We just replaced the dish machine 2 years ago." "I know, but it's not about the machine," Vanessa said, and there was something in her tone now, something pointed. "It's about the whole setup. It's cramped, and it's inefficient, and honestly, it's kind of depressing back there." She paused and then added, almost as an afterthought, "And maybe we should think about hiring someone with a little more energy, someone younger." Daniel's hand stilled in the water. He didn't look up, didn't let his face show anything, but he felt the words land, felt them sink in. Marcella was quiet for a moment, and then she said, gently but firmly, "Daniel does a good job. I have no complaints about his work." I know," Vanessa said quickly. "I'm just saying, maybe we could find someone who's a little more, I don't know, invested, someone who actually cares about being here." "Vanessa," Marcella said, and there was a warning in her voice now, a note of disapproval. "That's enough." Vanessa held up her hands, smiling that bright, empty smile. "I'm just trying to help," she said. "I want this place to be the best it can be. That's all." And then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and uncomfortable. Marcella stood there for a moment, and then she glanced over at Daniel, and their eyes met for just a second. He thought he saw something in her expression, something like regret or maybe embarrassment. But then she looked away and went back to her conversation with Rick, and the moment passed. Daniel returned to his work, scrubbing plates with a little more force than necessary, and he told himself it didn't matter, that Vanessa's words didn't matter, that he was fine, he was doing his job, and that was enough. But later that night, when he was alone in his apartment, sitting in the worn armchair by the window with a cold cup of tea in his hands, he felt the weariness settle over him again, deeper this time, heavier. And he wondered, not for the first time, if he'd made a mistake coming here, if he should have kept moving, kept searching for a place where he could truly disappear, truly be left alone. Outside, the rain had stopped and the night was quiet and still, and the streets gleamed under the streetlights like polished glass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a lonely sound, and Daniel closed his eyes and let himself feel the exhaustion, let himself acknowledge the hurt. Tomorrow he would wake up and do it all again. But tonight, just for tonight, he let himself feel tired. Act 3. The Quiet Discovery. The autumn deepened, and the days grew shorter, the light fading earlier each evening until it felt like the world was always in twilight, always in that soft in-between time where the boundaries between things became blurred and uncertain. The trees along Main Street lost the last of their leaves, and the branches stood bare and black against the gray sky. And there was a chill in the air now that made people walk a little faster, hunch their shoulders a little more, seek out the warmth of indoors with a kind of urgency. Daniel continued his work at Marcella's, and the rhythm of his days remained unchanged. Scrub, rinse, stack, scrub, rinse, stack. The dishes piled up, and he washed them, and the kitchen moved around him in its constant dance of heat and noise and hurried movement. Vanessa continued to make her little comments, her little jabs, but Daniel had learned to let them slide off him, to build a kind of protective shell around himself that made her words feel distant and unimportant. But then something unexpected happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of the quieter days at the restaurant, when the lunch crowd had thinned out and the dinner rush was still hours away. Daniel was in the middle of washing the last of the lunch dishes, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions when Marcela came into the kitchen. She was alone, which was unusual. She rarely came back without Rick or one of the other staff with her. And she was carrying a large cardboard box, the kind with a lid that suggested it held something important, something worth preserving. She set the box down on the prep station and looked around, and when her eyes landed on Daniel, she paused, and then she walked over to him. "Daniel," she said, and her voice was softer than usual, a little hesitant. "Do you have a moment?" He looked up, surprised, and turned off the water, wiping his hands on his apron. "Of course," he said. Marcella glanced at the box and then back at him, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read, something that looked almost like curiosity, or maybe confusion. "I was going through some old files in my office," she said, "and I found something that I think you might want to see." She reached into the box and pulled out a magazine, an old issue, the pages yellowed and the cover worn. She held it out to him, and Daniel took it, his brow furrowing as he looked down at it. It was a food magazine, one of the big ones, glossy and well-known, and on the cover there was a photo of a beautifully plated dish, something elegant and artistic, and beneath it, in bold letters, the headline, "The New Voices of Food Criticism, 10 Writers Changing the Way We Eat." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a flutter of recognition, of old memory stirring. "Turn to page 48, Marcella said quietly. He did, his fingers trembling slightly, and there it was. A spread about emerging food critics, complete with photos and short bios, and in the middle of the page, there was a picture of him. A younger him, maybe 15 years ago, his hair darker, his face less lined, wearing a button-down shirt and a confident smile. And beneath the photo, his name, Daniel Harrington. He stared at it for a long moment, not quite believing what he was seeing, and then he read the text, the words that described his career, his approach to writing, his philosophy on food and criticism, and the importance of honoring the work that went into every meal. It was strange, reading about himself in the third person, reading about a life that felt so distant now, so far removed from who he'd become. "I found it in a stack of old magazines I'd saved," Marcella said, and her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "I collect them sometimes, the food magazines, for ideas, for inspiration, and I was flipping through this one, and I saw your face, and I thought it looked familiar, and then I saw your name." Daniel looked up at her, and he didn't know what to say. His mind was racing, spinning, trying to figure out how to respond, trying to decide if he should deny it, make an excuse, disappear before this became a bigger thing than it needed to be. But Marcella just looked at him with those clear eyes, and she said very softly, "You were a food critic." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a recognition, and there was no accusation in it, no judgment, just a simple acknowledgement of a fact. Daniel took a breath, and then he nodded. "Yes," he said quietly, "I was." They stood there in the quiet kitchen, the magazine still in his hands, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Marcella reached out and gently took the magazine from him, setting it back in the box. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. No anger, just a kind of puzzlement. Daniel looked down at his hands, at the redness of his skin, the calluses on his palms. "Because that's not who I am anymore," he said. "I left that life behind. I needed to. And I didn't want anyone here to know, because I didn't want to be that person again. I just wanted to be ordinary, anonymous." Marcella was quiet for a moment, and then she nodded slowly. "I can understand that," she said. "Sometimes we need to walk away from things, even good things, to find ourselves again." Daniel felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said. "For understanding." Marcella smiled, a small, sad smile. "Your secret is safe with me," she said. "I won't tell anyone." "But—" She hesitated, and then she said, "But I want you to know that I'm glad you're here. You do good work, Daniel. Honest work, and that matters." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and Marcella picked up the box and turned to leave. But then she paused at the door and looked back at him. "Just one question," she said. "Why Millbrook? Why here?" Daniel thought about it for a moment, and then he said, "Because it felt quiet. Because it felt like a place where I could disappear. And because your restaurant felt warm. It felt like home." Marcella's smile widened, just a little, and she nodded. "I'm glad," she said. And then she was gone, back through the door, leaving Daniel alone in the kitchen with the sound of the water dripping from the faucet and the hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of garlic and rosemary hanging in the air. He stood there for a long time, his hands still damp, his heart beating a little too fast, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, but something close to it. Something that felt like possibility, like maybe the past didn't have to haunt him forever, like maybe he could be both people, the one he was and the one he'd been, and find a way to make peace with it. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, faint and tentative, like promises whispered in the dark. Act 4. The Tender Rising Action. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, dreamlike quality, as if the world had shifted just slightly off its axis, and everything was now illuminated from a different angle, revealing details that had been hidden before. Marcella kept her word. She didn't tell anyone about Daniel's past, didn't mention the magazine or the photos or the career he'd left behind, but something had changed. Between them, a kind of understanding had been reached. And now when she came into the kitchen, she would sometimes stop and ask him how he was doing, really doing, and he would answer honestly, and she would nod and smile that sad, knowing smile. And she started to watch Vanessa more carefully. Daniel noticed it in small ways. The way Marcella would gently correct her granddaughter when she was short with the servers. The way she would step in when Vanessa was about to say something cutting, redirecting the conversation with a kind of practiced ease that spoke of years of managing difficult situations. Vanessa didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. But the rest of the staff noticed, and there was a kind of relief in their eyes, a sense that maybe things were starting to shift, that maybe Vanessa's casual cruelty wouldn't be allowed to continue unchecked. But Vanessa herself remained unchanged. If anything, she seemed to double down, as if she sensed that her grandmother's attention was divided now, that she wasn't getting the same unquestioning approval she'd always received. She became more pointed in her comments to Daniel, more deliberate in her attempts to belittle him. She would bring back dirty dishes and set them down with exaggerated care, as if he were too incompetent to handle them properly. She would make jokes to the servers about the help, in a voice loud enough for him to hear. She would sigh dramatically when she came into the kitchen and saw him working, as if his mere presence was an inconvenience. And then, one evening in late November, something happened that changed everything. It was a Friday night, and the restaurant was busier than usual, filled with the energy of the weekend, people celebrating, unwinding, enjoying themselves. The dining room glowed with soft light, and there was laughter and the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation, and it felt warm and alive and full of joy. A man came in alone, sometime around 7 o'clock. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes and an air of quiet authority that made people instinctively step aside to let him pass. He was dressed simply but expensively, a dark sweater, well-tailored pants, leather shoes that had been polished to a high shine. He asked for a table for one, and the hostess seated him in a corner by the window, a good table with a view of the street. Vanessa noticed him immediately. She always noticed well-dressed men, always paid attention to people who looked like they had money. She drifted over to his table, smiling that bright smile, and she introduced herself, saying she was the assistant manager and asking if there was anything special he needed, anything at all. The man smiled politely and said he was fine, thank you, and Vanessa lingered for a moment, trying to engage him in conversation, but he was gracious and distant, and eventually she moved on, though Daniel could see her glancing back at him. Throughout the evening, as if she were waiting for an opportunity to impress him, the man ordered carefully, thoughtfully, asking questions about the preparation of certain dishes, about the sourcing of ingredients, about the chef's background. The server who took his order, a young woman named Lisa, came back into the kitchen looking a little flustered, saying that the man at table 12 seemed to really know his food, that he was asking all sorts of detailed questions, and Rick, the chef, perked up at that, his professional pride engaged. "Make sure everything is perfect," Rick said to the line cooks. "This guy sounds like he knows what he's doing." And so they took extra care with his meal, plating everything beautifully, making sure the temperatures were right, the seasonings balanced, the presentation impeccable. Daniel watched from his station as the plates went out, and he felt a strange sense of recognition, a kind of kinship with the man he'd never met, because he knew that kind of attention to detail, that kind of careful observation. He'd done the same thing himself, once upon a time, sitting alone in restaurants, taking notes, paying attention to every element of the experience. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite, and he seemed pleased, nodding to himself, occasionally jotting something down in a small notebook he kept beside his plate. When he finished, he ordered dessert and coffee, and he sat there for a long time, just watching the restaurant, observing the flow of service, the interactions between staff and customers, the rhythm of the evening. And then Vanessa made her mistake. She was walking through the dining room, checking on tables, and she passed by the kitchen entrance just as the door swung open and Daniel emerged, carrying a large bus tub full of dirty dishes from the dining room that one of the servers had left on the counter. He was moving carefully, balancing the weight, his eyes on the path ahead, and he didn't see Vanessa until it was almost too late. She stopped directly in front of him, blocking his path, and she looked down at the bus tub with that familiar expression of disdain. "You know," she said, loud enough that several nearby tables could hear, "you really should use the service entrance. It's not exactly pleasant for the customers to see this." She gestured vaguely at him, at the bus tub, at everything he represented in her mind. Daniel stopped, and for a moment he just looked at her. He'd been about to step around her, to avoid confrontation as he always did, but something in him shifted. Maybe it was the long accumulation of slights, or maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was simply that he was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated as less than human. "I'm doing my job," he said quietly, "just like everyone else here." Vanessa laughed, that sharp, brittle sound. "Oh, please. You're washing dishes. It's not exactly a career." And that's when the man at table 12 stood up. He walked over to them, moving with that same quiet authority, and he said, in a voice that was polite but carried an unmistakable weight, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear." Vanessa turned to him, her expression shifting immediately into that bright, charming smile. "Oh, I'm so sorry. We didn't mean to disturb you. Is everything all right with your meal?" The man looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at Daniel, and there was something in his eyes, a kind of recognition, a kind of understanding. "Everything was excellent," he said. "In fact, it was some of the best food I've had in months. Your chef is talented, and your servers are attentive and professional." Vanessa beamed. "That's wonderful to hear. We really pride ourselves on—" "But I have to say," the man continued, and his tone was still polite, still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "I'm troubled by what I just witnessed. The way you spoke to this gentleman was disrespectful and unkind." Vanessa's smile faltered. I was just—" "You were just being rude," the man said simply. "And in a business like this, where hospitality is everything, that kind of behavior is unacceptable." There was a silence then, heavy and uncomfortable, and Daniel could feel eyes on them now, other diners watching, servers pausing in their work. Vanessa's face had gone pale, and then red, and she looked like she wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. The man turned to Daniel. "I apologize," he said. "You deserved better than that." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and the man gave him a small, understanding smile, and then he turned and walked back to his table, where he paid his bill and left, disappearing into the night. Vanessa stood there for a moment, frozen, and then she turned and walked quickly toward the back office, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and Daniel could see that her hands were shaking. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the moment passing, but something had changed. The servers were whispering to each other, and Carla had come out of the kitchen and was standing near the swinging door, her arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. And Marcella, who had been in the back office and hadn't witnessed the confrontation, came out a few minutes later, and Vanessa was with her, and they had a long, quiet conversation that Daniel couldn't hear but could feel the weight of. Later that night, after the restaurant had closed and the staff had gone home, Daniel was finishing up the last of the dishes, his hands moving through the familiar motions, when Marcella came back into the kitchen. She looked tired, older somehow, and she walked over to him and stood there for a moment, just watching him work. "I heard what happened," she said finally. Daniel looked up, and he saw the sadness in her eyes, the disappointment, and he felt a pang of sympathy for her, because he understood what it was like to love someone who hurt other people, to want to protect them even when they didn't deserve it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Marcella shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. Vanessa, she needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around her, that other people matter." She paused, and then she said, "The man who spoke up, do you know who he was?" Daniel shook his head. "Nay, just a customer." Marcella pulled something out of her pocket, a business card, and she handed it to him. "He left this with his payment. I looked him up." Daniel took the card and looked down at it, and his eyes widened. The name on the card was James Whitmore, and beneath it, in small, elegant letters, Senior Food Critic, National Culinary Review. He stared at it for a long moment, and then he looked up at Marcella, and she nodded slowly. "He's one of the most respected critics in the country," she said. "He can make or break a restaurant with a single review." Daniel felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name: surprise, fear, recognition, irony. Did he know who I was?" "I don't know," Marcella said. "But I think maybe he recognized something in you, something that mattered to him." She took the card back and tucked it into her pocket, and then she put her hand on Daniel's shoulder, a brief, warm gesture. "Get some rest," she said. "We'll figure this out." And then she was gone, and Daniel was alone in the quiet kitchen, and he turned back to the sink and finished the last of the dishes, his mind racing, his heart beating a little too fast. And he told himself that everything would be okay, that this was just another moment, just another ripple in the pond. But deep down, he knew that something had shifted, something irrevocable, and that the life he'd built here, quiet and anonymous and safe, was about to change in ways he couldn't yet predict. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and the stars were bright overhead, countless and distant, and the world kept turning, indifferent and eternal, and Daniel dried his hands and untied his apron and walked out into the darkness, heading home. Act 5. The Soft Resolution and Emotional Healing. The review came out 3 weeks later, just before Christmas, when the town was decorated with lights and wreaths, and the air smelled like pine and cinnamon and wood smoke. Daniel didn't know about it at first. He'd stopped reading food publications years ago, stopped keeping track of the industry, stopped caring about reviews and ratings and all the noise that came with that world. But Marcella knew. She came into the kitchen one morning, early, before the restaurant had opened, and she was holding a printed copy of the review, and her face was radiant, glowing with a kind of joy that Daniel hadn't seen in her before. "Daniel," she said, and her voice was trembling slightly, "you need to see this." He took the paper from her, his hands still damp from the prep work he'd been doing, and he read the headline. "A hidden gem in Millbrook, Marcella's reminds us why we love food." And then he read the review itself, every word, and he felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight and knotted for so long. James Whitmore had written about the meal he'd had, describing each dish in loving detail, praising the chef's skill and creativity, commending the freshness of the ingredients and the thoughtfulness of the preparation. But he'd also written about the atmosphere, the warmth of the dining room, the kindness of the servers, the sense that Marcella's was a place where people genuinely cared about their work and about their guests. And then, in the last paragraph, he'd written something that made Daniel's breath catch. "But what struck me most about Marcella's was an encounter I witnessed between the staff, a moment that revealed the true character of this establishment. I watched as a young manager spoke dismissively to one of the kitchen staff, treating him as invisible, as less than. And I watched as that staff member, a dishwasher who carried himself with quiet dignity, simply continued his work with grace and professionalism. It reminded me that a restaurant is only as good as how it treats every member of its team, from the chef to the person washing the dishes. True hospitality begins with respect. And while the manager's behavior was disappointing, I was heartened by the response from the rest of the staff and the owner, who clearly value every person who contributes to the success of this wonderful restaurant. Marcella's is a place where food is prepared with love and served with genuine care, and it deserves to be celebrated. Daniel read it twice, 3 times, and then he set the paper down on the counter and looked up at Marcella, and she was smiling at him with tears in her eyes. "He saw you," she said softly. "He really saw you." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and Marcella reached out and squeezed his hand, and for a moment, they just stood there in the quiet kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows, and it felt like something had been healed, some old wound finally given the chance to close. The review changed things for Marcella's. Reservations flooded in, the phone ringing constantly, people driving from neighboring towns just to eat at the restaurant that James Whitmore had praised so highly. The dining room was packed every night, and Rick and his crew were working harder than ever, and there was an energy in the place now, a kind of excitement and pride that lifted everyone's spirits. And Marcella made changes. She sat Vanessa down in the office and had a long, difficult conversation with her granddaughter, and Daniel didn't know the details of what was said, but when Vanessa emerged, her eyes were red, and she looked smaller somehow, less sure of herself. She apologized to Daniel, awkwardly and stiffly, and he accepted it with grace because he understood that growth was hard, that learning to see your own flaws was one of the most painful things a person could do. Vanessa started working differently after that. She was quieter, more careful in how she spoke to people, and while the change didn't happen overnight, it was there, a slow softening, a gradual recognition that kindness mattered, that people mattered. She would still make mistakes, would still slip into old habits sometimes, but she was trying, and that counted for something. Marcella also made another change, one that surprised everyone. She promoted Daniel. Not to a management position. That wasn't what he wanted, and she understood that. But she moved him out of the dish pit and into the kitchen proper, giving him a role as a prep cook and occasional assistant to Rick, who had been quietly lobbying for more help. Daniel was hesitant at first, worried that he wouldn't remember how to work with food, how to move in a professional kitchen, but it came back to him quickly. The muscle memory, the instincts, and he found that he enjoyed it, enjoyed the creativity of it, the collaboration, the way he could contribute something meaningful beyond just cleaning up after others. And Rick, once he understood who Daniel had been, what he'd done, treated him with a kind of respectful curiosity, asking questions about techniques and approaches and philosophies, and they would have long conversations during the quiet moments between services, and a friendship began to grow between them, built on mutual respect and shared passion. Christmas came, and the restaurant was decorated with garlands and twinkling lights, and Marcella threw a staff party on Christmas Eve after the last customer had left. They pushed the tables together and laid out a feast, and everyone ate and drank and laughed, and there was music playing softly in the background, old standards and gentle carols, and it felt like family, like belonging. Daniel sat at the end of one of the tables, watching the others, and he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the wine or the food. He felt seen. He felt valued. He felt like he was part of something again, something good and real and meaningful. Vanessa sat across from him at one point, and she looked at him with something like curiosity, something like respect, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I'm sorry for everything." Daniel looked at her, and he saw that she meant it, that there was genuine remorse in her eyes, and he nodded. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." And she smiled, a real smile this time, not bright or empty, but genuine. And then she turned to talk to someone else, and the moment passed, but it lingered. A small moment of healing, a small step toward redemption. Later that night, after the party had ended and everyone had gone home, Daniel walked back to his apartment through the quiet streets, and the snow was falling softly, big flakes that caught the light from the street lamps and glowed like tiny stars. The world was hushed and peaceful, and his breath made clouds in the cold air, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt content. Not happy in some grand, overwhelming way, but content, settled, at peace. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. And the space felt warm and welcoming, and he made himself a cup of tea and sat in the armchair by the window, looking out at the snowy street below. And he thought about the path that had led him here, all the twists and turns and mistakes and losses. And he realized that maybe it had all been necessary, that maybe he'd needed to lose everything to find this quiet, simple life, to find the sense of belonging. And he thought about James Whitmore, the critic who had stood up for him, who had seen him when everyone else looked through him, and he felt a deep gratitude, not just for the defense, but for the reminder that kindness mattered, that witnessing mattered, that sometimes all it took to change someone's life was to see them, really see them, and acknowledge their humanity. He sipped his tea and watched the snow fall, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight, soft and resonant and calming, and he closed his eyes and let himself rest, let himself feel the peace that had eluded him for so long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dishes to prepare, new people to serve, new moments of connection and growth. But tonight, he was here, in this quiet apartment, in this small town, in this life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Act 6. The Sleep Descent. The winter settled over Millbrook like a soft blanket, covering the town in layers of snow and frost, and the world became quiet, muffled, peaceful. The days were short now, the sun rising late and setting early, and the long evenings stretched out, filled with the warm glow of lamps and the crackle of fires and the gentle hum of life moving at a slower, more deliberate pace. Daniel found himself falling into a new rhythm, one that felt different from before, richer somehow, more textured. His mornings still started early, but now he would walk to the restaurant and spend time in the kitchen, working alongside Rick and the others, learning new techniques, sharing old ones, contributing his knowledge and experience in ways that felt meaningful and appreciated. He would prep vegetables, their colors bright against the cutting board, carrots, orange and sweet, bell peppers, red and yellow, onions, white and layered like secrets. He would make stocks, slow-simmering pots of bones and aromatics that filled the kitchen with warmth and the deep, comforting smell of home. The work was physical, demanding, but it didn't exhaust him the way the dishwashing had. Instead, it energized him, gave him a sense of purpose, a sense of being part of something creative and alive, and the camaraderie with the other kitchen staff, the easy banter, the shared jokes, the moments of triumph when a dish came out perfectly. All of it felt like healing, like the slow knitting together of something that had been broken. Marcella would come into the kitchen sometimes and watch him work, and she would smile, that warm, knowing smile. And sometimes she would tell him stories about the restaurant, about the early days when she and her husband had first opened it, about the challenges they'd faced, the joys they'd experienced, the community they'd built, and Daniel would listen, and he would feel a connection to something larger than himself. A sense of being part of a history, a legacy, something that would continue long after he was gone. Vanessa, too, was changing, slowly but perceptibly. She spent less time on her phone, more time actually working, learning the business in a way she hadn't before. She would shadow Marcella during service, taking notes, asking questions, and while she still had moments of thoughtlessness, moments where the old habits crept back in, she was trying, genuinely trying, and that mattered. She and Daniel developed a kind of professional respect, not quite friendship, but something warmer than mere tolerance. And when they passed each other in the hallway or the kitchen, they would nod, acknowledging each other's presence, and it felt like progress. The restaurant thrived. The review had brought in new customers, and many of them became regulars, drawn back by the quality of the food and the warmth of the atmosphere, and the sense that Marcella's was a place where they were truly welcomed. The staff worked hard, but there was joy in it, a sense of shared purpose, and even on the busiest nights. When the kitchen was chaos and the dining room was packed, there was an underlying current of satisfaction, of pride in what they were creating together. And James Whitmore came back. He arrived one snowy evening in late January, walking through the door with that same quiet authority. And when Marcella saw him, her face lit up, and she greeted him warmly, genuinely grateful for what his review had done for her restaurant. He asked for a table, and she seated him in the same corner by the window, and this time, when Vanessa came over to introduce herself, she was respectful, professional, and he smiled at her kindly and complimented her on the improvements he'd noticed in the restaurant since his last visit. Daniel was working in the kitchen when Rick came over and told him that Whitmore was back, and Daniel felt a flutter of nervousness, of old anxiety, but also a kind of excitement, a curiosity about what the critic would think of the new menu, the new dishes they'd been working on. Rick insisted that Daniel help plate some of the dishes that went out to Whitmore's table, and Daniel did, carefully, thoughtfully, adding small touches. A sprig of herbs here, a drizzle of sauce there, and it felt good, felt right, to be contributing to something that mattered. When Whitmore finished his meal, he asked to speak to the chef, and Rick went out into the dining room, and they had a brief conversation that Daniel couldn't hear. But then Whitmore asked if Daniel was working that evening, and Rick nodded and went back into the kitchen and told Daniel that the critic wanted to meet him. Daniel felt his heart skip, and he wiped his hands on his apron and followed Rick out into the dining room. And there was Whitmore, standing by his table, and when he saw Daniel, he smiled, a genuine warm smile, and he extended his hand. "Daniel Harrington," he said. "I thought it might be you." Daniel shook his hand, and he said, a little sheepishly, "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me." "Of course I remember you," Whitmore said. "Your work was always thoughtful, always fair. I respected you, even when we disagreed about a particular restaurant or dish. The industry lost something when you left." Daniel felt a lump in his throat, and he managed to say, "Thank you. That means a great deal." They talked for a few minutes, standing there in the warm dining room with the snow falling softly outside the window, and Whitmore asked about what had brought Daniel to Millbrook, and Daniel told him, briefly, about the burnout, the need for change, the search for peace. And Whitmore nodded, understanding in his eyes, and he said, "Sometimes we need to step away to remember why we love something in the first place." And then he said, "I hope you know that you're making a difference here, not just with the food, but with the way you carry yourself, the way you treat others. That matters. That's what hospitality is really about." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and Whitmore squeezed his shoulder gently and then left, disappearing into the snowy night. And Daniel stood there for a moment, feeling something shift inside him, something that felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. He went back into the kitchen, and the night continued, and he worked alongside his colleagues. And when the last customer had left, and the dishes had been washed, and the kitchen had been cleaned, he walked home through the quiet streets, and the snow crunched under his feet, and the air was cold and clean, and he felt a sense of completion, a sense of having come full circle. In his apartment, he made a cup of chamomile tea and sat in the armchair by the window, and he looked out at the town, at the soft glow of the streetlights, at the shapes of the buildings against the dark sky, and he thought about all the paths his life had taken, all the choices he'd made, the good ones and the bad ones, and he realized that he wouldn't change any of it, because it had all led him here, to this moment, to this quiet, peaceful place where he felt valued and seen and part of something meaningful. He thought about Vanessa, about her journey toward becoming a better person, and he felt a kind of tender hope for her, a belief that she would continue to grow, to learn, to find her own path toward kindness and compassion. He thought about Marcella, about her strength and her wisdom and her ability to create a space where people felt safe and welcomed, and he felt grateful to have known her, to have been given a second chance by her. And he thought about the work he was doing now, the simple, honest work of preparing food, of contributing to something that brought people joy and comfort and connection, and he realized that this was what he'd been searching for all along, not recognition or acclaim or success, but purpose and belonging, and the quiet satisfaction of doing something well, something that mattered. The tea grew cold in his hands, and the night deepened around him, and somewhere in the distance an owl called, its voice low and mournful and strangely comforting, and Daniel closed his eyes and let himself drift, let himself float on the gentle current of his thoughts, and he felt the tension leave his body, felt his breathing slow and deepen, felt himself begin to sink into that soft, welcoming space between waking and sleeping. He thought about the dishwasher he'd been, scrubbing plates in the back of a kitchen, invisible and overlooked, and he thought about the food critic he'd been before that, writing reviews in fancy restaurants, always observing, always judging, never quite participating. And he realized that both of those versions of himself were part of who he was now, that the experiences had shaped him, had taught him humility and empathy and the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone, no matter their role or their station in life. And he thought about dignity, about how it wasn't something that could be given or taken away by others, but something that lived inside you, something you chose to hold on to even when the world tried to strip it away. He'd held on to his dignity in the dish pit, had held on to his worth even when Vanessa had tried to diminish him, and that had mattered, had made all the difference. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the world in a layer of white, erasing the sharp edges, smoothing everything into gentle curves and soft shapes. The town slept, and the restaurant slept, and somewhere in the quiet darkness, people dreamed of warmth and food and connection, of being seen and valued and loved. And Daniel sat in his chair, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even, and he felt himself letting go, felt himself releasing all the old hurts and fears and regrets, felt them drift away like snow melting in the morning sun. He felt peace settle over him, deep and abiding, and he let himself rest in it, let himself be held by it, let himself trust that tomorrow would come and that he would be ready for it, that he would wake up and begin again, and that it would be enough. The teacup slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the arm of the chair, and he didn't notice, didn't care, because he was already drifting, already sinking into that deep, warm darkness where thoughts became dreams and dreams became something softer still, something that felt like coming home. He thought about the people he'd met here, the kindness they'd shown him, the second chances they'd given him, and he felt a wave of gratitude so strong it brought tears to his closed eyes, and he let them fall. Let them roll down his cheeks because they were good tears, healing tears, tears that washed away the last of the old pain and left him feeling clean and new and ready. And then he thought about nothing at all, just felt the soft embrace of sleep, the gentle pull of rest, and he surrendered to it completely, letting it carry him away, letting it wrap around him like a warm blanket, like a loving hand, like the promise of a new day, a new beginning, a new chance to be kind, to be useful, to be part of something good. The snow fell outside, silent and eternal, and the night held him gently, and Daniel slept, deeply and peacefully. His breathing slow and steady, his body relaxed, his mind quiet. And in his dreams, he was back in the restaurant. But it was different now, warmer, brighter, filled with light and laughter and the sound of people coming together, sharing meals, sharing stories, sharing their lives. And he was part of it, not invisible but seen, not forgotten but remembered, not alone but surrounded by warmth and connection and love. And in that dream, he smiled, and it was a real smile, genuine and full, and it stayed with him even as he slept, even as the hours passed and the night deepened and the world turned slowly on its axis, moving toward morning, toward light, toward the promise of another day. And everything was soft, and everything was warm, and everything was safe, and he rested there in that peaceful place, and he was finally, truly, completely at peace. The end.